Well, good evening, everybody. My name is David Maguire. I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Greenwich, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to this inaugural lecture. It's especially a great pleasure to welcome all the people from outside the university who've come here this evening. We're here to celebrate the work of Steve Belmain, who's a professor at the university, who's had a spectacular career, which I'll describe a little bit about, and then the main event, of course, is Steve will come and deliver his lecture. Well, life began academically, at least, when he studied at the University of Vermont in New England in the United States, graduating in 1990 with a degree in biology. He then spent 2 years in Mali working for the Peace Corps, which I guess is where you gained an interest in tropical ideas and tropical society and agriculture and other things. He then came to London to study at Birkbeck College for a master's and then a PhD. He graduated in 1997 with a PhD in the ecology of the death watch beetle. That's the thing which lives in churches and other old buildings and goes knock, knock, knock as it eats the thing from the inside out. His interest actually in rodents was developed by chance. When he started working at the NRI, he was dispatched, as many staff are, to far-flung corners of the earth to look at grain and post-harvest losses and other subjects. And whilst he was there, discovered an awful lot about rat infestations and the problems that they have in that part of the world. And from that, developed an interest in it and rapidly became familiar with the literature, the science, and the ecology of rodents, and developed over a decade or so into one of not just this country's leading experts, but one of the world experts in this area. He's been working on rodents as vectors of pests in agriculture for quite some time now, and that's really become one of his principal interests here at the Natural Resources Institute. He's been looking at the spread of a number of diseases, including Lassa fever and bubonic plague, something that you thought died out in the 17th century, didn't you? But no, it's still prevalent in some parts of the world. His work has attracted not just scientific accolades, but also it's been of interest to the wider public through his work in media. He produced a really important program for the Discovery Channel about rat swarms in the Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh, which is a good read if you're stuck at home on a wet Wednesday evening sometime. And, of course, other parts of the week as well. And since working with the NRI, he's continued to travel across the world to look at a number of interesting scientific problems. He publishes widely and also has been a source of significant research funding into the NRI to maintain not only his own work, but that of a team that he's assembled around him. So please join me in welcoming Steve Belmain.
Thank you, David, for that very wonderful introduction, and I'd like to add my own sort of welcome to you all. Thank you for coming, and I particularly appreciate those who've come from outside the Institute and taking your free time out of your busy lives to come along to this lecture to listen about some of the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years here at the Natural Resources Institute. It's great to see so many here, and I suspect my title, having sex in my title, has been maybe one of the reasons why you've come along. Sex is not a great part of my talk, but it's certainly the implications of sex and how rodents breed is dealing with the implications of that is quite important. But not to deceive anyone thinking that I'm not going to talk about sex at all, just a very brief video here for those who came for the sex. This is all the sex I'm really going to show you. And most of my talk is really about the implications of this, what happens when rodents breed and reproduce at very large levels. So before I start my talk, it'd be good to get an idea of how many people here have had problems with rodents in their houses or in their gardens. So just show of hands. Who here in the past has had problems with rodents? Yeah, it's a good number of people who've had rodents in their houses or gardens, and that's here mainly in a sort of a UK environment. If I was to ask that sort of same question in Africa or Asia, to be sure everyone would be raising their hand. They would have big problems, and much more severe problems than you may have with the occasional mouse or rat in your property. And that's probably one of the things I would like to highlight, is that there is a sort of growing dichotomy between what's happening in the developed world versus the developing world. And rodent problems really are a very severe problem, I think, for people in developing countries. And our awareness of this is, I think, sometimes quite limited. And that's been one of the things that I sort of was surprised about when I got involved, as David pointed out, more or less by accident. My eyes were open and suddenly there's these huge rat problems and no one seems to be doing much about it. So rodents are a neglected problem, and I think that's quite surprising if you think of if you just think of the history of rodents. We've already talked about bubonic plague. There have been, in the history of humanity, there have been major impacts of disease pandemics around the world. I'll talk about a few of those as part of my lecture. But it's not just about diseases. There have been some big problems with famine, regional famine, where people essentially are starving to death because of rodent population outbreaks, and even cases where those famines have led to civil war. So these sort of quite severe impacts, people often don't have the awareness of that. So I think, there are really good problems that we don't have good solutions for. And I'm hoping some of the work that I'll show you shows that there are some real solutions. As a scientist getting involved in this, I think, as I've said, I've been quite surprised how neglected this field is. There aren't many people around the world who are actually working on rodents as pests. And there are a number of reasons for this, I think, and I'll try to bring out some of those things. Often we know very little about the ecology of different rodent species affecting the tropics in Africa and Asia. And there's a lot of other issues related to sort of sociology and anthropology that I think are quite important too. And this little video gives you a flavor of some of this anthropology issues. So, I mean, that raises a whole bunch of issues in my mind about this whole idea that we try to control rodents and we fail. The rats are just too clever. And I think, again, you'll see photos like this where rats come along and they steal the cheese and your trap doesn't go off. And that's very frustrating. And I think this all gets sort of tied up in a lot of the culture and our abilities as humans to what we call anthropomorphize other animals. We give animals human characteristics in order to be able to relate to them and try to understand why things are happening, why we're failing perhaps in controlling rodents. So rodents are, very good swimmers, and this is one of the abilities of them to be able to migrate and move off into new habitats, infest islands, and get to new food sources. They're very good climbers. So again, they can climb straight up walls like this. And that, of course, makes it very difficult to keep them out of our buildings. They can crawl across, small, they're great trapeze artists. They can crawl across and jump and get to places very easily. But they're not very good musicians. Despite all the things that you've seen in cartoons as children, our ideas of rodents are very much influenced, I think, by this sort of use in films and stories and books from a young age, going back to the Pied Piper, to Mickey Mouse and Tom and Jerry. We really have, these sort of cute, cuddly rodents as friends, and this influences, I think, our idea of rats really are clever. Look at what they're doing in these films, yes? And trying to separate out that sort of fact from fiction, I think it sort of clouds our judgment sometimes and how we can actually approach some of the problems. This is another thing that I'm always amazed about, is these stories that come out in the press about giant rats. And it seems particularly here in Britain, we love a story about giant rats, rats that you can't exterminate, and they're as big as cows. And pretty much all the time, these sort of stories are coming out. This is an article that came out in the Independent just a couple of months ago about some guy who found a rat as big as a small child. And if you look at that photo there, I mean, the rat looks pretty big. But what he's doing, of course, is about perspective here. You know, he's holding it out on this stick in front of you, and it really isn't that big. It's it's a question of how these photos are almost staged in a sense. And this story, originated here in London, and then it's spread around the world. You know, it's translated to all these different languages and stories throughout Europe and elsewhere in the world about this giant rat found in London. And the reality is of course all the rats here are Norway rats. And they simply cannot get that big. And there's no evidence, scientific evidence, that rats are getting that big in this country. Yet we still like those stories. So again, it's about how we think and what sort of stimulates the imagination sometimes. In other parts of the world, rodents have a different sociology or a different perspective from the human perspective. So for example, this is in Hindu temples where rodents are seen as servants of the gods. So in these sort of situation, rats are sort of actively encouraged. They come into these temples, they're fed out in the open, and people will feed from the same porridge that they're feeding to the rats. So with my cap on as a disease expert, this is a perfect opportunity for disease to be spread from rats to humans. But again, are we actually worried about that and that concern? People are eating this because they think it's a good thing to do in religious terms. In other parts of the world, rats are eaten. So again, if you're trying to control rats with poisons, this is something you need to think about. So this is photos from Vietnam where rodents are served at weddings as part of the wedding feast. And in many other parts of the world, rodents are also considered a delicacy. So these are some photos I took of rodent preparation in Mozambique, where they're pretty much eating the entire rat, guts and all, and it's not very well cooked. So again, if you're thinking of disease transmission, this is not an ideal situation, but of course people are using this as a source of protein. So are we to tell them not to eat rats? From our perspective, we might think it's disgusting. They think they taste great, and they probably don't have a lot of other sources of animal protein in their diet. So what are we to do? We need to understand all these sort of sociological issues in order to develop a proper management strategy that takes them into account. So I just want to give you a brief sort of overview of some of the impacts that rodents have on our livelihoods. I think we're probably largely aware of this, but it really is quite a broad impact across pretty much any crop we try to grow. So this is a rice crop in Asia, and all these sort of green areas you see here in the middle, this is where the rats have actually eaten all the rice. The only rice that's left is around the edges here where it's a bit more yellowish, where the rice is still ripening. And rice is one of those crops where actually rodents are known to have a very big impact. So in some countries, they've done some very good assessments to understand what are the losses due to rats in rice production. And so in Indonesia, they know pretty accurately they're losing about 17% of their rice crop to rodents. In Vietnam, it's even higher, 30% they're losing. So through some fairly basic calculations on the amount of rice they produce and how much people eat, and you can make some fairly general assumptions about how much loss is occurring here across the entire Asian continent. So if you assume that, based on 17 and 30%, assume a very conservative 5% loss across the entire Asian continent, that would be enough to feed about 180 million people if you were able to reduce that loss caused by rodents. If you then thought about doubling that to 10%, which again seems fairly reasonable based on the information we had, that would be enough to feed about 360 million people. And that's roughly about a third to half of the people who are undernourished in the world. So being able to save that amount of rice could really go some way to dealing with food insecurity problems and people being malnourished in many parts of the world. But many other crops, this is maize, which is a big crop, particularly in Africa, being damaged by rodents, coconuts, oranges, pineapples, chili peppers, beans, sugarcane. You get the idea. Pretty much anything we try to grow can be damaged by rodents in quite high numbers, high levels. And it doesn't stop there. After the food is harvested, we put it into store. So this is rice that's obviously being quite severely contaminated with rodent feces. The urine, of course, you can't see here, but the urine is there as well, and other diseases. Maize cobs being stored, and you can see the rodents are just coming in and gnawing away the maize grain. They get into packaging, so this is in the further processing of food, where they're getting into factories that are processing food, and even to this extent where they're being baked and sliced in bread. These things, of course, hit the news when this happens, but in many other cases, we really don't have good information of the sort of contamination that's going on. And it's not just about food. So electrical wires, I've certainly had many stories of people's cars being damaged while the rodents get up in their car and chew on the wiring. But it can be any sorts of wires. Some of these wires are in houses. I've had stories of hospitals burning down because of rodents getting in and damaging the electrical wiring and causing fires. So this is a lead pipe. So rodents are gnawing through these pipes, damaging them. Plastic pipes, again, these may be for sewage or water transport, all being sort of gnawed through. And into the foundations of people's houses. So this is a house in Bangladesh, but in many parts of the world, people use mud bricks and mud to build their houses, at least in part. And here you can see down in the foundation where rodents are burrowing into that, and another place where rodents are getting into these foundations. And many of the people in these communities complain that their houses actually fall down eventually because the rodents sort of undermine the entire structure. The monsoon rains come, and the house collapses because of the rodent activity in their houses. And of course, things people put in their houses, so whether that's blankets and baskets and utensils, other sorts of fabrics, clothes, mosquito nets, all of these things are being attacked by rodents. When this happens, it's an economic catastrophe for the family. They have to go out and buy a new mosquito net or buy a new shirt. So there's a big monetary input to this sort of damage. Now moving on to diseases. We know there are many, many diseases. We already talked about bubonic plague. Bubonic plague hasn't gone away. But there are many other diseases. Most of these are relatively neglected. We don't actually know a lot about these diseases. We're collecting information on all these diseases, but often they're not well diagnosed, and often we don't have very good treatments for them. And of course, this is related to rodents being mammals. They're like ourselves. This is one reason why rodents have been used so much in medical research to develop new drugs and medicines for humans and domestic livestock. It's because they have a common physiology with us. But that's also one of the reasons why they make great reservoirs, because they can go off to a dirty environment and then, often in some rubbish tip or a toilet, pick up bacteria and viruses there, and then they come into our kitchens and spread those diseases around. So that sort of living alongside humans and moving between different habitats really makes them fantastic spreaders of disease and picking up diseases and developing diseases which will affect our own bodies in the same way it affects their bodies. And one of the real challenges here is that rodents in their involvement in all these different diseases is that how they're actually involved. And this is where it becomes interesting in an ecological point of view, is what is their role in transmitting these diseases. Sometimes it's actually directly, sometimes they may be spoiling the environment or putting some of the pathogens into the environment, or it may be through many other vectors such as fleas and ticks and other sort of ectoparasites that are on their bodies. So just a few examples of diseases that I particularly have had an interest in, which I think may be familiar to you or may not. Leptospirosis, you will know that here as Weil's disease. It's not a big problem in the UK. There are a few cases every year, mainly amongst cattle and pig farmers. So there are every year maybe a handful of cases. But in other parts of the world, this is a really serious disease. It gets into the water, and rodents are one of the main reservoirs, but other animals are also involved. So domestic livestock can pick up this disease. They also get ill, but those domestic livestock may also transmit the disease to humans. And just to highlight how important this disease is, this is information that is collected by the World Health Organization on leptospirosis. And all these little dots here are showing cases of leptospirosis that have been documented on a website they run, this healthmap.org. So you can actually go to this WHO-sponsored website and type in all kinds of infectious diseases, and it will give you a current update on what's actually going on in the world. So here you can see leptospirosis is particularly a problem in the Americas, Southeast Asia. There's quite a lot of cases even in Europe from looking at that map. And leptospirosis, again, it's a neglected disease. Although it's global, we really don't know a lot about it. Even though it has quite a high mortality, most of the problems are to do with this sort of debilitation. It's the fact that it makes people ill for a very long time when they should be actively out in the field doing agricultural work, for example. They become ill for a long period of time. It's often misdiagnosed or not even diagnosed, confused with malaria, dengue, and other sort of fever-type diseases. So just as an example, again, this happened a few years ago. There was a typhoon that swept through the Philippines, and it caused a massive outbreak of leptospirosis in Manila and in other places around the Philippines. And just to compare with another disease, which of course has much greater awareness, HIV/AIDS, if you look in the year 2008, they had about 500 cases and 4 deaths and about 800 cases of leptospirosis. Then when the typhoon came through, suddenly there was a massive peak in the number of leptospirosis cases and quite a high mortality case. And yet we all have this awareness about AIDS, but leptospirosis is just not reaching the agenda, the people who set the policies, and we just don't know much about it. Plague has already been mentioned. Of course, we all know it from the times of the Black Death, particularly here in Europe. And we know it as bubonic plague because of the swelling of the buboes. So this is the swelling of the lymph glands in the groin and in the armpit. And it's quite a distinct symptom. So when you have plague, you pretty much know that it's plague. This is where the name Black Death comes from, because it leads to septicemia and gangrene. And that's not a very good thing to happen, and as well as pneumonic plague, and this is of course where plague then becomes transmissible from human to human if someone coughs out an aerosol of blood particles once it's entered into their lungs. So plague is a very old disease. This is a scan of a book that was printed in 1655 here in London. And even in those days, it was a disease of poverty. It was obviously people didn't know it was a biological infection. And so it was seen as something that you could pray about, and religion would save you. You would pray to save the sinners who had contracted plague. And unfortunately, things really haven't changed much since then. Plague is still seen very much as a curse in many parts of the world. This is a guy that I came across in Tanzania who believed he could lift the curse of plague by chanting and doing various rituals, and it is still very widely believed in many parts of Africa it is a curse and not a disease. Plague is very rarely out of the news, even though it's not a big problem in most of the developed world. But it is this aspect of panic, I think, in that sort of link to history again that makes us think, ooh, plague, something really scary, and it is. This is just a short example of what happened in India a few years ago, about 20 years ago in 1994, where India had not had plague for quite some time, and then suddenly they had an outbreak of it, and there was absolute panic in the whole country. And the whole country was embargoed, so India was put under quarantine. So there were no international flights, all sort of international shipping by sea, by land, everything shut down. It's a major economic catastrophe for the country, and this was from a small outbreak in one city that wasn't very well sort of controlled. It was sensationalized by the media, by the government. There was a run on antibiotics. It really couldn't have been much worse. So I think this is why plague is so clear in our minds sometimes. It is a disease that's spread around the world, but it is mainly in Africa now. So it used to be mainly in Asia, but it seems that most of that is now shifted to Africa, where about almost 90% of cases are coming from particularly South and in Eastern Africa. Lassa fever is another disease you may have heard of. It's really confined to West Africa, particularly Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Nigeria, but it is spreading, and this is another thing that I've been interested in. Why is this disease spreading? There are other viruses related to Lassa fever found elsewhere in Africa, and many other diseases by these viruses, particularly in South America, all transmitted by rodents. This is another disease. Perhaps you haven't heard so much about hantaviruses. This is another category of viruses that lead to quite severe human disease. A number of different rodent species are involved, and we're finding new hantaviruses all the time. So this list is growing all the time. Many different rodent species and associated with different diseases in different parts of the world. But it's not a new disease. This is a disease, again, that goes back to ancient times, particularly in the Americas. So at the time of the conquistadors coming over to particularly the Aztec area of Mexico, there were well-documented huge outbreaks of disease. This Coccolizzi disease is actually caused by a hantavirus. So you can see quite massive population declines were caused by this disease in the 16th century Mexico. So plagues, rodent diseases have caused many plagues in history, and I fear the story isn't finished. There are new diseases, I think, developing within small mammals. We've all heard of the tragedies with Ebola, which of course isn't a rodent-borne disease, it's a bat-borne disease. But there are many other diseases on this list which I fear are perhaps being mutating and changing in a great way, and there are quite a lot of books that go into greater detail about these aspects of human encroachment on wild habitats and how that might develop new human diseases. So if you are interested, I encourage you to look more into this. Another aspect of rodent problems, rat bites. We may think, oh, it can't happen very often, but in many of the communities I go to, about 10% of the population is being bitten by rats on a regular basis. So here you can see a boy who's been bitten on the back of his foot and a woman who's been bitten on the bottom of her foot. So that may introduce bacteria straight from the rodent's mouth, but of course you can imagine this woman's walking around barefoot. Other infections getting into those wounds is fairly common as well. And some of these can be quite gruesome. These next slides even more gruesome. You may want to look away, where a girl has been bitten on her neck and baby's had his nose completely bitten off by a rodent. And it's not just a developing country issue. This was, again, not too long ago here in the United Kingdom, where it hit the press that someone in a care home was attacked by a rodent, in quite sensationalist terms, eaten alive. But obviously it was quite a traumatic experience for this woman who was vulnerable in a hospital. And there are other cases like this as well in many parts of what we would call the developed world, where rodents can get in and start biting people. So despite all this information about diseases, there's still a lot of confusion about it, and I think we are starting to get on top of this. More and more people are looking at these undifferentiated fevers that report to hospital, and quite a good number of clinical specialists are now discovering that many of these people reporting to hospital, they don't have malaria, they actually have rat-borne diseases. And this may be leptospirosis, and different kinds of typhus and other diseases that have similar symptoms. So I think we are raising awareness at that clinical level that rat-borne diseases are important. We shouldn't ignore them when we're reporting to hospitals with particularly fevers in the tropics. So I've already mentioned, I think, that rodents do have these many sort of low mortality type diseases, but it's how do we actually understand what is the economic impact of a disease that's chronic, like leptospirosis, that is debilitating someone for a long time and unable to then work and be productive. And I think that this is one of the real challenges, is how do we actually quantify and assess a disease? What is its real impact on our lives? I don't think we quite understand how to do that yet. And beyond that, what we actually do to control rodents, I think sometimes can be very dangerous. So many of the poisons that are traditionally used really haven't been designed to control rats. So one of them is this product called aldicarb, which is widely sold on the black market across Africa as a rat poison. It's also sold to kill guard dogs and even to kill people. It's a very toxic substance. This is a small amount up here. This is the way it's usually sold. It's about the size of a matchstick. And the amount of aldicarb in that small package is enough to kill 100 people if it was to be fed to in some sort of bait. So it's a highly toxic substance, and there's many concerns about having this available, even though it's not supposed to be available this way. It's to control nematodes in agriculture. It's being misused in many ways. So to try to sum up this sort of aspect of impact, I think one of the real challenges is that there's so many different impacts. It's all these agricultural crops, it's all these different diseases. How do we actually quantify what is the real impact of rodents on our lives in economic terms in order to convince people that this is a serious problem? And it is not an easy challenge. We've been trying to do this ourselves, myself and my team, and I think there's a lot more that needs to be done to try to evaluate the impact of rodents in economic terms. So one of the things that I've been particularly interested in my research is focused really at this sort of household level. So these are different examples of houses, particularly in Africa. You can have quite high density housing, so it's more like a squatter camp here, villages or houses that are more isolated. What you see here is that the houses are pretty poor quality. Rodents pretty much go into these houses. And this has been largely neglected by those few people who are working on rodents. They've tended to focus on field crop problems and not really looking at these sort of aspects of post-harvest issues and the disease transmission that goes on in these sorts of environments. So when I first started in NRI, this is one of the first things I did related to rodents was going out to Mozambique and to Zambezia province, which is sort of here in the center of the country. And this was as part of a big program that was funded by the British government to try to redevelop Mozambique after its civil war. And World Vision, the NGO, was very much in charge of this program. And they did some very good assessments that found that rodents were a really big problem. And so you can see the kind of housing that people were living in. You can pretty much see through this house. It's not a very well-made house by any standards. And the rats were living up in the thatching of this roof and eating food inside that was stored inside those houses. So most of those houses had a large platform inside where they would stack up their maize cobs like this. They would have the kitchen fire below that where they would cook their food, and the smoke and heat from that fire would be very good in keeping the insects out, but it did nothing to keep the rats out of this large food store. They also had big problems with rats, of course, in their field crops. And we just wanted to see what the problems were. So yes, we saw there were people being bitten by rats, people eating rats, and this was an area also where bubonic plague was endemic and people were contracting plague. So it really was a mess of a problem with rodents that seemed to be largely ignored. So what I did is I set off with a bunch of rat traps in my suitcase, and here I'm going to slightly digress to demonstrate the different traps. So this is the sort of new trap that I would say is far better than the old sort of traps that you'll be familiar with, these sort of old Victor type traps. And the reason why is these traps are so much easier to set. So you just sort of lock and click them in place, and you have this large treadle here, and the bar only has to go a short distance there. So it goes off very easily, it's very effective, it's also very easy to set if you're not very familiar with setting traps. These old design traps, which is what we used to have, and still many people use them, they're much more fiddly to set. You know, you've got to set it down and set it, and it's hard to do. And then, so we've been trying to promote these new design traps. It really is possible to make a better rat trap. And so this was really the sort of the basis of the work that we did in Mozambique. And this is just to first demonstrate this. What we did essentially is we gave each household a trap and told them to intensively trap. So we did this in these different regions of Zambezia province, Moro Balagure and Namakura. And in these communities, every house had one of these rat traps, and they were setting it off every day. They would set it in the evening, and almost invariably they would catch a rat. In other communities, they weren't intensively trapping. So we did this in a sort of a treatment control. These communities only had a rat trap 3 days a month. And so they were trapping, but not probably reducing the population. And here you can really see in these communities that were trapping intensively at the community level, the trap success dramatically declined. So they're actually reducing the rat population through that intensive trapping. And we can compare that against what would happen if they really weren't doing that trapping. And this really became the basis of quite a lot of the research that I'll talk about later. So if you just sort of add up the numbers here, in this one community, it's mainly these two species of rodent that are being trapped. And if you've got about 200 rats here, about 150 there. So in these communities, they're trapping pretty much a rat every day, all year long. That's an awful lot of rats. Some communities, not quite so many, but still, you're catching 70 or so rats in a year, and here again, 200, 250 rats or so in those communities. So very, very high numbers of rats. Remember, this is inside their house. This isn't outdoors. This is inside their house where they sleep. So around the same time, I became very aware of sort of the disease problems, and fortunately I was able to put together a project which was called RatZooMan, short for Rodent Zoonosis Management. So this was a project that we really wanted to understand more about what's going on with the dynamics of disease transmission. And it was one of these European Union funded projects with many partners involved from different countries in Europe and Africa, and really quite multidisciplinary in the types of expertise that were required to try to deal with some of these complex problems. So we had anthropologists, economists, rodent experts, geographical information people, all sorts of different people coming together to work as a team to try to pick apart some of these problems, to really understand what's going on. And I could really give you a very long talk in itself just on the RatZooMan project and the sort of outcomes and objectives of it. We really had quite grand ideas on what we wanted to try to achieve, to first of all understand how these diseases might be transmitted, how they might be exacerbated by climate change and our own activities such as deforestation. And there's a lot I could talk about, but just to give you one example of what this project was able to achieve. I'm going to focus on one particular community. So this is what is politely called an informal settlement, and what we would impolitely call a squatter camp or some sort of slum. And this is in the city of Durban in South Africa. So you can see a sort of a larger pan picture here of what this sort of Cato Crest community looks like. And you can see most of the houses are made of sort of recycled materials, or sort of whatever you have to hand, you put together a house. There's no sewage, there's no plumbing, there's no electricity, and pretty much everything runs down into this river, which is down here in the valley, which runs through this community. All the rubbish gets tipped into there, and you can imagine there's a lot of rats around in this community. And so we wanted to look at all these different aspects. What's going on with the rodents, what's going on with diseases in the rodents, what's going on with the human population. So we broke this community down into different transects and different sections. So all these little lines around here are different areas where we were sampling the rodent population, what species of rodent there, what diseases are we finding there, and taking soil samples and various other aspects of data from these different parts of the community. And here you can see, again, this is Cato Crest. This is in the city of Durban. It's a small area here. And so these little dots here are showing where we're finding the presence of diseases in the rodents and the different species of rodents that we're finding there. On top of that, we then wanted to overlap what's going on with the human population. So we needed to take blood samples from community members and screen them for diseases. So we're layering all this together, all this information, and for the community to try to see what's actually going on here. And quite interestingly, probably without surprise, we were finding there were certain hotspots where disease was very prevalent in the rodent population. Fortunately, we didn't find any human cases of disease, both historical or present, but certainly around these areas. So a tuck shop is like a little restaurant or small convenience store where there's a lot of food around. And most people would have to travel to these small sort of water collection points where there's a tap where they could get water. And there's a lot of water spilled here, it's very wet. And both of these situations is where we were finding positive rodents. And so this really inspired the community, as well as the authorities, to try to do something about this. Rubbish was a big problem. So based on these results that we found, we were actually able to sort of motivate the community and motivate the local government to try to clean everything up, try to make it a bit better. So they established rubbish collection points. They started a rodent trapping campaign, which they called the Ratzuman campaign, and it's still ongoing. I'm pleased to say 10 years later, this Ratzuman project has this clear sort of legacy in the sense that they still know what the Ratzuman project is, and they're still doing this sort of trapping and trying to maintain things in a more sanitary way in this community. So related to this, and through that sort of Ratzuman project, I got involved particularly with the World Health Organization, who was interested in many of these diseases. So leptospirosis is another thing that I've continued to work on. I showed you this map earlier about cases of leptospirosis, and what was really struck in my mind is how Africa is completely absent of any documented cases of leptospirosis. And so through further research that we did, we were able to show that actually a lot of this has to do in how the disease is detected. And the types of leptospira that we were looking for weren't correct. So it was down to how we were doing the diagnosis. So in a sense, by changing how things done, we were able to show a tenfold increase in detection of leptospirosis in Africa. So I expect this map will change quite dramatically in next year, showing a lot more leptospirosis is actually present. Many more human cases are there. They're just not being diagnosed correctly because they're using the wrong toolkits. And plague is another disease that, particularly on the environmental side, of trying to understand how this disease persists in the environment and how it is transmitted, again, has been a big focus of my work, trying to look at the complexity of how this disease is moving between rodents, humans, and other animals. And so, again, if you're interested in that, this publication gives you a bit more of an overview of some of that work. I've also been involved quite a lot in training for the World Health Organization on plague, particularly in Africa, trying to improve people's capacity to understand how this disease is transmitted and how it can be mitigated. Lassa fever, again, is a disease that we've been particularly interested in and how it actually transmits. And like plague, Lassa fever is one of these diseases you originally catch it from a rodent, but then it can transmit human to human and lead to quite large-scale outbreaks in hospital settings as well as in communities. And so through that work, we were able to show quite clear links between what's going on at the human level. So a lot of this is actually driven by the harvest cycle, people growing crops and moving food to their houses, and then the rodents just follow that food into their house. So all those rodents, possibly some of them carrying certain diseases, are then concentrated inside your houses. And so I think this is one of the focuses that I would like to look at more in the future, is trying to understand these dynamics between agriculture and health, and how our agricultural practices are probably exacerbating and really sort of perpetuating a lot of these diseases in developing countries. I think, we move all this food, so here, here's the guy's bed, and these are his big sacks of grain right next to his bed. So the rodents are coming in, eating that food because that's, the only food that's around in the environment at that time, and possibly biting you while you sleep and transmitting diseases just by being around in that environment. So moving on to the next section of my talk, this is particularly about these abilities of rodents to reach these epidemic proportions, to become a plague in themselves. And it's a problem that's found in many parts of the world. So this sort of video on the right is in Australia, where they have well-known mouse plagues. And more on the left is more in Asia, particularly China, where this video was taken. And it's a very old phenomenon. Again, this is a photo from Australia. Down here at the bottom, you can't probably read what it says, but I've written it up here. So that's 500,000 mice, 8 tons of mice that were caught over 4 nights. It's a huge quantity of mice. And that is when these epidemics happen, and essentially all the crops are lost, all the wheat fields in Australia are destroyed when these events happen. And this is, again, coming back to sex and breeding. This is, rodents have this phenomenal capacity to breed very quickly. So within the time period of one rice crop, one female rat can breed 3 times. So she has one litter, gets rid of that, the next litter, and the next litter, and it's still within the same rice crop. At the same time, this first litter that she's had reaches maturity before the rice crop ends and are also able to breed. So this very quickly allows you to sort of see how one rat can lead to very many rats within a short period of time. And this is all driven by food availability. So imagine what happens when food is abundant. When food is there for a very long period of time, rats just continue to breed. And one of the things that's very important in terms of physiology here is rodents are able to undergo what's called postpartum estrus. So as soon as they give birth, they're able to mate the next day and get pregnant again. So while they're weaning and nursing one group of rodents, they are pregnant with the next. And as soon as the ones that they are weaning leave the home, they give birth the next day. So they are baby factories. They're able to reproduce at very phenomenal rates, and that's one of the reasons why they can reach epidemic proportions so quickly. I'm now going to slightly digress and tell you a little bit about bamboo, because this is essential to the next part of understanding what goes on. Is bamboo has different characteristics which you may not be familiar with. One particular kind of bamboo has this ability to flower synchronously. So the entire bamboo forest flowers at the same time. And this leads to what's called a masting event. And for example, in this part of the world, this is at the border between Bangladesh, India, and Burma. This is one very big forest of bamboo, essentially, and from India down into what's called the Chittagong Hill Tracts and into Burma here. And when these flowers all come out, essentially on a 50-year cycle, the entire forest dies, and then there's a huge production of seed. So this event happened 50 years ago, and it did lead to an actual civil war in Mizoram, which at that time was not an independent state within India. It was part of a greater province, and the Mizo people uprose from this famine, which was largely ignored by the Indian government and pressed for sort of statehood within the Indian system. So it happened again quite recently, and this is what I will tell you about. So this is what the forest looks like. This is what bamboo flowers look like. They're not very remarkable flowers, which lead to these very large seeds, which the rodents eat. And so you may find it hard to see here, but down here in this rice field, there are rodents all over, and this guy is trying to kill them with a slingshot. So this is, essentially, that's the only tool he has available to try to deal with all these rodents who are rapidly eating his rice crop, and he's trying to kill them before they do so. So I happened to be working in Bangladesh when this outbreak occurred, and was well positioned to go out and try to assist the Bangladesh government. I was also working a lot with the United Nations Development Program and FAO to try to collect information on what was going on with these outbreaks. So I helped put together baseline information, make them understand which are the areas most affected and what was actually happening, and confirming that information. Communities were very much saying this is a big problem. So here you can see these are all community leaders with tails from rats that they were trying to show to the authorities. This is the scale of the problem that we have, number of rats. And so one of the first things we did in trying to understand the research is really what's happening with the rodents here and trying to understand the breeding capacity. So we were trapping rodents over a very long time, over several years, to try to understand what's going on. And the thing to point out here is these areas where these two lines are quite close to each other are where most of the females are in a breeding condition. So these are areas where all the rodents are breeding, and that means that is followed by a peak. So these are all the sort of offspring that are being produced in large numbers. This peak happened at the time when rice is being harvested. So if all these rodents are suddenly appearing in the environment when it's just at the right time to harvest your rice, you can imagine it's devastating for the farmers. This one happened slightly after. So farmers weren't so worried in this particular area at the time because they'd already harvested their rice when the peak happened. So we also wanted to look at what's going on with the bamboo itself. So all these seeds are coming out. And one of the phenomena with bamboo is that most of the bamboo is actually underground. And here you can see the bamboo is cut down, but then the seeds and the flowers just re-emerge out of the ground. So you can't actually stop the process. It's a genetic process. But if you cut down the forest, do you actually delay this process? And yes, we could actually show that the onset of flowers is delayed by a couple of months by doing so, by treating different parts of the forest in different ways. And that, of course, has an impact on the seed production. So we've delayed the seed production by a couple of months. And the reason why we thought that could be important is, of course, that shortens the breeding time of the rodents. There's less food around over a shorter period of time. So the amount of seed is also reduced, probably not significantly to affect rodent breeding, but there certainly was less seed around. So this is a theoretical picture here now. We don't actually have all the evidence to show this, but essentially what happens is, in a normal situation, the bamboo starts, the rat population starts breeding, and bamboo seed is present over all these months, and then the population goes up just at the time when the rice is being harvested. So you have famine and serious problems in the community, and it's not very nice. What we think we can now do by changing this onset of the seed production, reducing seed production, we shift things a bit closer together. So the rat population simply doesn't have the same amount of time to develop to such epidemic proportions. So we think we've got some good ideas on how we can actually perhaps mitigate these problems in the future, but we're going to have to wait 50 years for the next cycle of bamboo to really find out what's going on here. This led to a documentary that was already mentioned. If you are interested in watching this, you can go to YouTube and type in Swarm Chasers Rats, and it will come up on YouTube. It's a 45-minute documentary following me through the process of working in Bangladesh to try to find these rat swarms and do something about it. We also put together a book that deals with these outbreaks in many parts of the world, not just what was going on in Bangladesh. Again, you can find this book online if you're interested to find out more about this phenomenon of rodent outbreaks. So the final section of my talk is really about some of the work that I've done to try to keep rodents under control in the management aspects. Rodenticides, of course, have been the real tool that we've been using. I've really tried to avoid their use. And the two reasons for this is that most poisons are quite expensive, they may not be available, and I think there's a lot of misuse of poisons. Trying to educate people on how to use them correctly has been a major challenge, and I think there are other things that farmers could be doing to try to manage the problems much more effectively. So this is why we've termed this term ecologically based rodent management. It's what else can we do to try to understand and manage rodent problems more effectively. So that is based fundamentally in trying to understand the rodents better and trying to know their biology and their ecology, what sort of damage they're doing, and what are people's attitudes and practices, and how we can actually influence those attitudes and practices. So essentially, it's not just about killing rodents, it's about really trying to see how we can actually change people's livelihoods in perhaps other ways that don't involve killing rodents at all. So one of the first things is understanding the different species. There's many different species out there. They all have their own behaviors, their own breeding dynamics. And that is there's not a lot of work on that, trying to understand what all these different species are doing, what are their real impacts on people's lives. So we do this by putting out traps in different environments, capturing them, understanding the breeding dynamics, what seasons and where they're going, and all that sort of interesting ecological information. We have to look at these complex environments where you have crops growing right next to communities, and there's all these other sort of environments around that rodents might be exploiting, and trying to understand where rodents go. So just as, again, a very brief example here, this is just trying to give you a schematic of what might be going on in Bangladesh, where you have these monsoonal floods come in. You have communities with houses and roads, and at certain times of year, everything else is flooded. Everything else is underwater. So the rodents have to be in the communities. Eventually, that water subsides, and rice crops are being grown, and then the rodents migrate out of the communities. And so you have rats breeding everywhere now. And eventually, that cycle will then complete. The rodents will have to come back as the floodwaters come back up again. And so this sort of shows you the dynamics over time of where, if you were going to try to control rodents, where would you do so? You try to control in these communities where the rodents are congregating, and if you do that at the right time, you could then perhaps stop this sort of immigration back out to the fields. So I've been fortunate enough to have funding from quite a number of different projects over time to look at these aspects in Bangladesh. Again, I'm not going to go through all the things we do. There's quite a lot of different components to this, but just to highlight a few examples, essentially coming back to what I first did in Mozambique and trying to put communities into intervention and non-intervention communities and trying to see how we can compare management in different places and see if it works. So tracking tiles is one of these tools which we can use to monitor rodent activity. So this is essentially just covering something in soot, whether that's a bathroom tile or a piece of metal, and then you can put this and wait for the rodents to put their footprints on it. So you can get an activity indicator of how many rodents are around in that environment. We also train the communities in setting these traps and get them out there, putting these traps in their houses. And essentially the same phenomena occurs. So you can see the rat population declines over time. People are intensively trapping at the community level. We can use those tracking tiles to show the difference. So again, if you have intervention and non-intervention communities, you can see a real difference in rodent activity. So this is the number of footprints that they leave behind on these tiles. And we can also ask the communities themselves what it is that they think their lives have improved. So this is quite laborious, but in a research context, we can hand out diaries like this and get people to record their activities in these diaries and help them complete that sort of information. And we see quite dramatic differences. From the farmers' perspective themselves, you can see that in the intervention areas, they spend much more, they're saving money, essentially. So this is in terms of finance here. They're saving money by implementing rodent control. This is, and again, if you look at the time that they take to do certain things. So, repairing their house walls has dramatically gone down by controlling rodents. And so, again, you can look at these things over time. So the only thing I'd really point out here is this line here. So this is repairing the house. And you can see if they're implementing rodent control over time, they're having a decline in the amount of time they need to spend repairing their house walls for all these holes that are inside. And this is in contrast to what's going on in communities that aren't controlling rodents. So here you can see in the video here, this is what it takes to repair all these holes in someone's house. So it's a big job that women spend a lot of time doing. Another thing that I was very keen on is being able to show farmers what they're actually losing in store. It's very hard for a farmer to get an understanding of how much grain is being lost because they're taking grain out themselves all the time. So we wanted to come up with some sort of assessment method where they could actually see how much rodents are eating from their food stores. And I'm going to whiz through this, but essentially it means putting a known quantity of grain in there. So we put these baskets in there, and we know how much is in that basket, and we can monitor that basket regularly to see what's actually being lost. So we've done this in a number of communities, not only in Bangladesh, but nearby in Myanmar. And you can see that losses go up quite dramatically over time. So these sampling intervals are essentially every 2 weeks, and you can see the amount that's being lost from this basket in kilos going up here. So very quickly, you're losing almost 50% of what was in the basket to begin with. And then we can use that as a tool to compare our rodent control. So if you have communities that are doing our community-intensive trapping versus other communities that are not, you can show that the rodent trapping is having a big impact on how much grain is being lost. So again, you get a fairly clear distinction between the two kinds of communities. Again, this has all been published if you're interested in finding out more about how this actually works. And this really led to a change in farmers' ideas. So these traditional stores are now often found, they put rat-proof baffles on the bottom and they try to put a lid on it. They never did before, but once they saw how much they were actually being able to lose, it really motivated a lot of people to try to protect their grain stores much more effectively. And again, as a sort of a good news story, even long after, a year after, of providing this sort of training and demonstration to the communities, most are still sort of carrying on and adopted these new technologies. Now moving from Bangladesh back to Africa, again, I've been quite lucky, I think, to have a number of different projects based here. I've already talked about rat zoom man, a bit on the diseases. I'm going to skip over Echo-Rat due to time and talk briefly about some of the work in a project that's currently ongoing called Stop Rats. And again, it's involving a number of different countries here in Africa, and a number of different partner institutions are involved in that, which I'm trying to lead in a coordinated way. So again, there are many different activities involved in this. I don't have time to go through them all, but just as an example of one of the things that I think that's of interest to us as scientists, but also trying to feed back to what farmers are telling us. When we go out and we speak to communities, they say, oh, I've got a cat, that's how I control my rats. As an ecologist, I'm more skeptical about the roles of domestic cats and dogs, so we wanted to go about testing it and wanted to figure out how can we actually do this. So this is essentially trying to adopt other ecological methods and use this in a pest control sphere. So one thing that other people have done in this sort of more natural environments, wild environments, try to understand predation risk is what's called giving up densities. So this is looking at the foraging behavior of an animal and how its foraging behavior will be modified depending on how safe it feels. So if it doesn't feel very safe, it'll run off. It won't stay a very long time at any particular place. If it feels very safe, it'll stay longer there, it'll feed longer from that particular patch. So there's a lot of research showing how this works in practice in a wild environment, but never in sort of a community pest control environment. So we've done some pretty good work in Swaziland over this past year, actually, looking at how we can use these giving up densities in a rural community type setting. So again, we use tracking tiles just to, again, give us a sort of a baseline. And then we put out these sort of feeding patches. So this is essentially a plastic box with sand in it, and we hide peanuts in the sand. So a rodent will come along and he'll try to find the peanuts and eat them. If he feels very safe, he'll spend more time there, he'll eat more peanuts. If he doesn't feel safe, he may only eat 1 or 2 peanuts and run away. So we can try to use this to understand where rodents feel more comfortable. So what we've done is we put these tracking tiles and feeding patches out in different environments around Swaziland homesteads, and we've done this where there are cats present, dogs present, cats and dogs present together, or nothing, so that we can actually see, do cats and dogs actually affect this sort of fear factor for rodents? And lo and behold, it does, but not in all situations. So if you have cats alone or dogs alone, there really is no difference from having no cats or dogs. The only situation where it seems to work is where you have both a cat and a dog at home. And that may be down to territorial marking or how there's more sort of a smell of predator around in those sorts of environments. Finally, the last piece of work I wanted to talk about is something, again, that's also quite recent, is looking at fertility control as a method to control rodents. Everything has really been focused on developing rodenticides, and fertility control has been increasingly promoted to control many other sorts of animals, larger mammals particularly. Nothing yet developed for something like rodents. But again, in these contexts of huge outbreaks of rodents, we thought this could be a beneficial tool. Outbreaks are not only something that's happening in Bangladesh, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Sahelian Africa, semi-arid parts of Africa are subject to these population outbreaks of rodents. And Tanzania, again, is quite well known which areas are more susceptible to these outbreaks in time. So we first wanted to test in the laboratory, can we control the fertility of rodents using certain compounds that had been trialed in China. So we fed these to rodents, and again, we could show that the testes weight would decline, sperm production would also decline, and indeed both males and females were affected by these compounds if they were fed in a laboratory type situation. With males, the sperm that are produced are not very viable. With females, it's essentially inducing edema, and under which situations they can't become pregnant. And if you pair the animals together, so you can do the different treatments here, treated versus untreated, etc., males and females, you can indeed find that it does affect their ability to produce offspring. So we then wanted to move to the field, and this is essentially, imagine this is a large field, and in the center of that we put a grid of traps. So these are these kinds of traps, these are live capture traps, and then we bait the entire area either with fertility control or rodenticide or nothing to do a comparison there, or what are the impacts of these different treatments. And so this is what it looks like. We put the bait in these little strips of bamboo to keep the bait safe from non-target species, put these out in the environment, and then the rodents are captured. We mark them and release them to understand what are the population dynamics in these different areas. And this is essentially the results of that sort of field trial, where essentially what happens with the rodenticide, that's the sort of orange line here, is after treatment, all the populations decline here because that's naturally happening. But then the rodenticide treatment, the population resurges and goes up to very high levels. What you have with the contraceptive, actually, is that the population stays low. So even though you're not killing the rodents, you're stopping them from breeding in response to increased food production in the environment. So this is quite promising. We believe that this could actually lead to a sustainable method of controlling rodent population outbreaks. We're doing more research to find out more about that. We've also been looking at the environmental sustainability of these things, trying to see, is there environmental contamination going on? We know this occurs with rodenticides. So far, all research should suggest these things do break down very quickly. We cannot find any residues in water or soil. So what next? I've given you a snapshot of some of the things that I've been involved in. I don't have all the answers yet. We still don't have all the answers yet. It is a neglected area. We need to do a lot more, I think, to raise awareness about the problems, and that there are indeed some real solutions out there to control rodents more effectively. A lot of what I've been doing is trying to build that capacity, working with my African colleagues, my Asian colleagues, to try to increase their abilities to recognize the problems and do more work on these aspects of rodent management. And finally, just to say a few thanks here to people who've really been crucial in my career as a rodent expert. Adrian Mayer is a chap who I think is known to a number of people here at NRI. He actually worked at the Ministry of Agriculture as a rodent expert for many years and set up his own private pest control industry. He really worked a lot with NRI, particularly in delivering some of its master's courses in grain storage, and he traveled with me a lot and pretty much taught me everything I know about being a rodent expert. George Rothschild is another person that's familiar to many people here at NRI, and he really took me under his wing and helped me connect with a number of other rodent experts around the world, particularly these guys here, Grant Singleton, Herrick Lears, and Charlie Krebs, who I continue to work with. And again, a big thanks to all my colleagues around the world. There are hundreds of them. I can't thank them all, but they know who they are, and I thank them intensely. And I also just want to say thanks to NRI and the university in general, because they've allowed me to have the academic freedom to pursue this, something that NRI really didn't have much expertise in the past about rodents, and I'm just able to develop it, and I was encouraged to do so. So thanks very much for giving me that sort of freedom. And again, thank you all for coming.